Cancer is one of the world's biggest killers, responsible for 1 in 6 deaths globally, and over a quarter of deaths in rich countries. But there's one kind of good thing about cancer. Unlike, say, coronavirus, you can't catch it or pass it on to other people. Right? Unfortunately, this is biology, so things aren't quite as simple as that. And in collaboration with Merck's The Sustainables, I'd like to explain how understanding contagious cancer could help us save lives and ecosystems. We'll start with a shaggy dog story. 10,000 years ago in East Asia, a large black dog developed a lump on its genitals. The bad news was, it was cancer. However, this tumour did something incredible. Rather than simply growing larger, spreading around the dog's body and eventually killing the dog and dying with it, another dog either had sex with this dog or sniffed or licked its, well, like dogs do, and the cancer was able to jump to this second dog. And then this happened again and again and again, transferring the tumour from dog to dog to dog after dog, until dog years became doggy centuries and eventually doggy millennia. 10 human millennia later, cells from this tumour are still going strong in millions of dogs all around the world. This ancient canine lives on the reproductive organs of modern dogs on every continent except Antarctica. It's known as canine transmissible venereal tumour, or CTVT, and it rarely kills its host. And it's now more parasite than dog. Though analysis of its DNA shows us that its cells were once those of a large black dog, it's accumulated millions of mutations in the intervening centuries. So many, in fact, that we aren't entirely sure if dog 0 was female or male, to the point that CTVT has arguably become an entirely new kind of organism. Is it canine, or is it cancer? I think it's neither. Instead, it's a giant, weird, distributed, incredibly long-lived parasitic organism which evolved from dogs, but is substantially less likely to chase after a stick. In fact, given that CTVT is now thousands of years old, you could make the case that it's one of the oldest complex organisms on the planet. CTVT is more curiosity than curse. It has a very low fatality rate and is easily treated with dog chemotherapy. But not all transmissible cancers are quite so benign. One of the more awful and ecologically destructive was first spotted in 1996, when a wildlife photographer snapped a Tasmanian devil with rather horrible-looking tumours on its face. If you don't want to see, look away now. Look at this poor devil. Okay, it's gone. Scientists investigated, and the lumps turned out to be another form of transmissible cancer, known as devil's facial tumour disease, or DFTD. DFTD is spread when Tasmanian devils fight, as they do quite often during the mating season, biting one another's faces and transmitting the tumour from animal to animal. And Tasmanian devils are a feisty bunch, so the tumour spread rapidly through the devil population. The number of devils each infected devil would go on to infect, known as R, which we've all obviously become very used to hearing about with coronavirus, started out at around 3.5. Quite similar to the original COVID outbreaks in March 2020, but thankfully with a much longer gap between infections, meaning that DFTD moved more slowly than COVID did. This is particularly fortunate because, unlike CTVT, DFTD is cruel and deadly. The tumours eventually become large enough that the devils just can't eat, and they starve to death. As a result, DFTD managed to wipe out about 80% of Tasmanian devils over a few decades. The good news is that DFTD's R has fallen to around 1, meaning that each infected devil only infects about one other, and case numbers are therefore stable. The bad news is that this fall in R has been driven in significant part by the large fall in population, creating a rather morbid form of devil social distancing. Conservationists are watching the devil's population numbers nervously, but luckily there are now signs that the survivors may have evolved some immunity to the disease. There are a few other transmissible animal cancers. Some species of shellfish can catch cancer from one another, for example. And there are probably more waiting to be discovered, at least in part because transmissible cancer was long assumed to be impossible, so scientists haven't spent a lot of time looking for them. But you'll be relieved to hear that there are very, very few reports of cancers transmitting between humans. Even if you were to cut out a piece of someone's tumour and insert it into your own body, disgusting though that would be, it would be very unlikely to settle into its new home successfully. Your immune system would recognise the other person's tumour cells as foreign, and it would destroy them. That's because your immune system is a very powerful weapon against anything that isn't made of your own cells. And that's why organ transplant recipients need to find an organ that's a match, from someone whose cells are similar enough to their own to minimise the immune response. And then they take drugs to suppress their immune system, just to be extra sure. Any foreign cells in your body, whether they be invading bacteria, someone else's transplanted liver, or someone else's cancerous tumour, should be destroyed by your immune system. However, there are a few rare occasions where this has happened anyway. One example is the case of a surgeon who cut himself while operating on a patient to remove their tumour. 5 months later, he developed a lump at the site of the cut, which was diagnosed as cancer. But DNA testing showed that it wasn't his. It had come from his patient. The surgeon probably got unlucky, with the cells in this tumour having evolved the ability to hide from his immune system. Far more common, but still thankfully pretty rare, is that 1 in every few thousand organ transplant recipients can have cancer transferred from their donor, and it can survive thanks in part to the immune-suppressing drugs that those transplant patients take. There's even been a particularly strange and unpleasant case of an HIV patient. Remember that HIV infects the immune system, so he was immune-suppressed too. And he caught cancer from a tapeworm in his intestine. The tapeworm's tumour cells spread all over his body, eventually killing him. And scientists only realised the tumours weren't human because the cells looked so tiny under the microscope. When he died, his doctors had no idea exactly what had killed him, until DNA testing revealed that these weren't some kind of new parasitic disease, but tapeworm cancer cells. So, except in a handful of cases of very bad luck, catching cancer requires a suppressed immune system. So does that mean it's bad news for Tasmanian devils, but good news for most humans? Well, not quite. We might not actually catch cancer itself, but we can catch an infectious disease that causes cancer. And this is far more common than a lot of people realise. Globally, 1 in 8 cancers are caused by infections. More than are caused by alcohol, obesity, and sun exposure combined. And yet, cancer-causing infections get shockingly little press. Leading the pack is a stomach bug called Helicobacter pylori, which is responsible for 4.8% of cancers. Most things we call stomach bugs actually infect the small intestine, which is a far more hospitable environment than the incredibly acidic interior of the stomach. H. pylori bacteria survive the acidity by burrowing into the protective layer of mucus that lines the stomach, away from the acid and also partially hidden from the immune system. That means that it can persist for years, and this causes a problem. The immune system's repeated failures to get rid of the bugs irritate the stomach lining and increase the risk of cancer. Most people don't experience any symptoms at all, but some will go on to develop stomach ulcers, and a few % will go on to develop stomach cancer, making H. pylori a significant cause of death. It can also cause a different form of cancer, called malt lymphoma, whose relationship with the bacteria is so close that if they die, it dies, making it the only form of cancer that we know of that can be treated with antibiotics. Next in the roster is human papillomavirus, or HPV, which is behind 4.1% of cancers. HPV is probably more familiar than H. pylori, because lots of people are now vaccinated for it. And actually, the main motivation for the HPV vaccine is to prevent the cancers, rather than to prevent the infection itself, which, again, usually doesn't have serious symptoms. The problem is, if the virus persists in the body, it can end up putting copies of its own DNA into the DNA of your cells, and these changes to our genetic code increase the risk of cancer. It's particularly bizarre that this seems to be entirely unintentional. Some viruses put their DNA into yours on purpose, as part of their life cycle, but HPV isn't one of those viruses. It gives us cancer, but seemingly with no benefit to itself. Nature can be cruel sometimes. But the good news is that vaccinating against HPV can dramatically reduce the risk of this weird side effect of infection, and it's estimated to have cut cervical cancer rates by 90% in countries with effective vaccination programs. Since almost all cases of cervical cancer are caused by these viruses, immunising teenagers against this usually harmless disease can have a huge impact on their cancer rates later in life, which I think is pretty amazing. As well as bacteria and viruses, it's also possible to get cancer due to infections with parasites, such as worms, and in far less unusual ways than catching worm cancer from them directly. One example is schistosomiasis, a disease which is caused by worms caught from contaminated water, with a rather disgusting life cycle. The worm larvae burrow into your skin and travel through the bloodstream to the liver, where they mature into adult worms. The adult worms then move to the bladder, where they lay their eggs, which are then peed out into the water again. In the water, they hatch, infect water-dwelling snails, and develop into larvae, which then burrow into the skin of a passing human and start their life cycle all over again. Parasites are really weird, aren't they? The damage done to the bladder wall by the eggs is what predisposes schistosomiasis sufferers to bladder cancer. And as if all that weren't enough, sometimes infections can join forces to cause cancer. So it is with Epstein-Barr virus, or EBV, and malaria, which is caused by the Plasmodium parasite. In 1962, a scientist called Dennis Burkitt discovered the cancer which now bears his name, Burkitt's lymphoma, and he noticed it was only found in the equatorial regions of Africa, except those higher than 5,000 feet. That's 1,500 metres in non-1960s units. It was later noticed that this corresponds to the range for malaria-carrying mosquitoes, so scientists set about trying to find a mosquito-borne disease that could be causing this cancer. And what they found was Epstein-Barr virus, which isn't carried by mosquitoes. In fact, it's most famously spread by kissing. Almost all of us get infected with EBV at some point in our lives. If you catch it as a child, it usually has few or no symptoms. If you get it as a teenager, often at a school disco, it can cause much more serious symptoms, known as glandular fever, and also known as kissing disease. Once any symptoms have subsided, the virus then hangs around for the rest of your life, hiding out in your immune cells and increasing the risk of a variety of forms of cancer. However, while EBV isn't transmitted by mosquitoes, we now know that malaria itself can worsen matters. The Plasmodium parasite makes those EBV-infected immune cells more likely to become cancerous, thus increasing the risk of lymphoma. Since almost everyone in the world has a smouldering EBV infection, Burkitt's lymphoma is much more common in areas where the malaria can spur it on. So much so that it looks like it's caused by malaria, when actually, as far as we know, malaria infection alone doesn't increase the risk of any form of cancer. So the good news is, under normal circumstances, cancer very much isn't contagious. The only contagion you should worry about if you're visiting a friend or a relative with cancer is to make sure that you don't give them anything, because cancer patients often have weakened immune systems, so what's a mild cold for you could be very serious for them. And the rare cases of catchable cancers in humans and animals help us to understand how cancer works and how it learns to evade our immune system. And that means we could develop new treatments. By understanding how cancer hides from the immune system, we could learn how to reveal it and expose it to the might of our body's powerful natural defences. As for the other contagious diseases, we already have lots of good reasons to develop vaccines and treatments and improve access to existing medicines for people in poorer countries. For example, charities that work to prevent or treat schistosomiasis and malaria are some of the cheapest ways to save and improve lives in the world, even before we take the cancer risk into account. The fact these diseases also cause cancer means that preventing or treating them is even more valuable than we already think it is, and is just another incentive to help those at risk. And the thing I most hope is contagious is the knowledge that infections can cause cancer. So go out there and tell 3.5 friends about the shocking number of cancers that are caused by bacteria, viruses and parasites. And if they tell 3.5 friends, and if their friends tell 3.5 friends and so on, it won't be long before we have a massive outbreak of wanting to do something about it. I'd like to thank Merck for sponsoring this video as part of the Sustainables. This project is all about showcasing Merck's work to improve lives and safeguard the environment. One of the case studies on Merck's Sustainables website is about global health, including malaria prevention, using an insect repellent called IR3535. And now you know why an insect repellent can actually help to reduce the risk of cancer. They're also donating tablets to fight schistosomiasis, which have treated nearly 500 million children since the programme started in 2007. You can find out more about these and loads more cool stuff at the links in the description.